Welcome to day one of our Bible stories or Bible adventures for Weird Animals, Weird Times. Because the stories we'll be focusing on are Bible stories, but they talk about things that happened during Bible days that seem really weird, both to us and felt really strange to the people in the stories too. So, as we share stories, the first story I'm going to share with you today is about 10 people who were dealing with a disease. Just like our world today is dealing with a virus, these people were also dealing with this terrible disease called leprosy. And people who had leprosy were called lepers. And leprosy was very contagious. And so the people in Bible times were really, really afraid and terrified of anyone who had leprosy. And so if you caught leprosy, you were sent out of town to live away from everybody, from your best friend, from your family, from everybody. You were sent away, and it was a very, very hard thing to face. And so I want you to think about the story a little bit. In your kits, you all have some spots. You can put on your spots because I want you to think about what it must have been like in Bible times to have leprosy. First of all, it meant that you couldn't keep on doing the normal things that you did. It meant that your friends played without you. You weren't allowed to go near them. At best, you could just watch them from a distance. Can you think of how left out those lepers must have felt? And it wasn't only their friends, but it was even their own families. They couldn't stay in the same house with their families. They were sent all out of town to live with each other because people who had leprosy, people who didn't have it, were too afraid to be around them. And so think of everything they missed. You know, birthday parties for their siblings, weddings, baptisms, things that we celebrate now. And I know we feel bad that we can't be together with our larger families for things, even facing the viruses that we face. But back in Jesus' day, if you had leprosy, you were totally left out, and it didn't get better. And so for the lepers in Jesus' day, it was a very, very sad condition. They had, even if they had to go into town, they had to yell, unclean, unclean, and everyone would stay away from them. They'd avoid them. I can't imagine how sad and lonely and left out they must have felt. But even outside of town, lepers heard the news about Jesus. They heard that Jesus was going through the towns and healing the blind and, helping folks who were deaf to hear, and for folks who couldn't walk to help them get up and move. He was healing sicknesses and diseases wherever he went. And so today's story talk about 10 lepers who were living together, maybe in a cave kind of like this, out of town somewhere. But they heard that Jesus was coming to town, and they had heard what Jesus had done. And so they wrapped themselves up, covered up their sores as best that they could, and they walked toward the town to try to see Jesus. They couldn't get too close because the people would have driven them out, would have made them leave. But slowly they approached, and as Jesus was in the town, instead of yelling, "Unclean, unclean," the way that they were supposed to, they yelled, "Jesus, Lord, have mercy on us." And they had to yell it really loud because they were kind of pushed back and away because they couldn't get close to the other people. But Jesus heard them. Jesus heard them and then did something that amazed everyone. Instead of seeing that they were lepers and walking away, Jesus walked toward them. He walked toward them. He looked at them, smiled at them, and then said, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." That's what Jesus said to people when they were healed. And slowly, they looked at one another and they looked at Jesus, and he smiled. And they went to show themselves to the priests. And as they were walking, an amazing thing happened. The amazing thing was that as they walked, they were healed. Their leprosy disappeared. And the reason I want you to hear that story is because I want you to recognize the Bible truth of today, that even when we feel left out, even when we are really left out and hurting, Jesus still loves us. Even when the world can't deal with us, Jesus always can. And Jesus offers us a place where we're loved and valued just as much as everyone else. And that if we draw strength from that, we'll be amazed at the miracles that Jesus can do that help us find our place in God's world, the place that God created us to take. And so again, even when we feel left out, Jesus loves us.
Once upon a time, there were 10 very sad men. They were sad for many reasons. They were sad because they were not allowed to live with their families. They could not even talk to the people they loved. They couldn't even be seen in the same neighborhood as the rest of the people. They weren't prisoners. They were lepers, and they were forced to live outside of the city in the wilderness. Now, leprosy is a terrible disease where you get sores all over your body. Many lepers lose their fingers, toes, and even their eyesight. Leprosy was very contagious, and so if you became a leper, you were immediately kicked out of town. Now, of the 10 sad lepers, 9 were from Jerusalem, and 1 was from Samaria. Now, the Jewish people from Jerusalem didn't like the Samaritans. They thought that people from Samaria were dirty and no good. All of the 10 lepers were sad, but the 1 leper from Samaria was especially sad and lonely. One day, the lepers heard some exciting news. They heard that Jesus from Nazareth was passing through their town on his way to Jerusalem. "Jesus is coming! Jesus is coming!" Everybody knew about Jesus, whether you lived inside the city or out in the wilderness. Jesus was a miracle worker, who some said was sent by God himself. Now the 9 Jewish lepers ran to the edge of town and waited for Jesus. And the 1 Samaritan leper followed behind the group and waited too. Finally, they heard a crowd in the distance. Jesus was coming! Jesus is coming! Jesus is coming! Just as Jesus was passing through the city, the 9 lepers shouted as loud as they could, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us! The Samaritan leper also shouted. Jesus stopped walking and turned towards the lepers, who were far off in the distance. And all the lepers shouted once again, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us! Jesus then cupped his hands over his mouth and shouted back, Go show yourselves to the priests! Jesus then walked away, and the crowd quickly followed after him. The 9 lepers all looked at each other, and they all still had the terrible disease. They knew that they could never enter the city unless the priests saw that their disease was gone. And as they wondered what to do, the one leper from Samaria ran off towards the temple. The other 9 lepers quickly ran off as well, and that's when the miracle happened. As the lepers were running to the temple to show themselves to the priest, their leprosy was completely cured. When they realized what happened, they jumped up and down for joy and continued running towards the temple. The one Samaritan leper, however, stopped and turned around. He began running as fast as he could back towards Jesus. When he caught up with him, he fell to the ground in front of him and said, Praise God, I'm healed. Then he couldn't stop thanking him. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That's when Jesus asked a very important question. Didn't I heal all 10 men? Where are the other 9? The other 9 never returned to say thank you to Jesus, and they missed out because of it.
The Invisible Boy, written by Trudy Ludwig, illustrated by Veggietales Bible. Can you see Brian the Invisible Boy? Even Mrs. Carlotti has trouble noticing him in her classroom. She's too busy dealing with Nathan and Sophie. Nathan has problems with what Mrs. Carlotti calls volume control. He uses his outside voice inside too much. Sophie whines and complains when she doesn't get her way. Nathan and Sophie take up a lot of space. Brian doesn't. When the bell rings for recess, Mika and JT take turns choosing kids for their kickball teams. The best players get picked first, then the best friends of the best players, then the friends of the best friends. Only Brian is left, still waiting and hoping. JT glances in Brian's direction and just as quickly looks away. We've got enough players for each team, he tells the others. Let's play ball. In the cafeteria, Madison and her friends talk about her birthday party. The rope swing over the pool was awesome, says JT. Yeah, so was the water slide, adds Fiona. That was the best pool party ever. I'm so glad you guys had fun, says Madison. Everybody did except Brian. He wasn't invited. At choosing time, while the other kids play board games and read, Brian sits at his table doing what he loves to do best. He draws fire-breathing dragons scaling tall buildings, space aliens locked in intergalactic battles, greedy pirates digging for treasure, and superheroes with the power to make friends wherever they go. On Monday morning, Mrs. Carlotti introduces Justin, a new student, to the class. Brian smiles shyly at him. Some of the other kids sneak looks at Justin, trying to figure out if he's cool enough to be their friend. They haven't quite made up their minds yet. At lunch, Madison and JT watch Justin eat with chopsticks. What's that? Asks Madison as she points at Justin's food. It's bulgogi. Bul what? Bulgogi. It's Korean barbecued beef. My grandma made it for me. It's really good. Do you want to try some? There's no way I'd eat bulgogi. And the kids laugh. All of them. That is, except Brian. He sits there wondering which is worse, being laughed at or feeling invisible. The next day, when Justin goes to his cubby to put away his backpack, he notices a piece of paper with his name on it. Justin, I thought the bulgogi looked good. Brian. At morning recess, Brian finds a piece of chalk on the ground and starts drawing away. You're Brian, right? Yeah. Thanks for the note. Hey Justin, Emilio calls out from the tetherball court. You're up next. Sorry, I gotta go, says Justin. By the way, that's a really cool drawing, he adds before taking off. Back in class, Mrs. Carlotti asks the kids to team up in 2s or 3s for a special project. The kids scurry around the room to pair off. Brian heads toward Justin. I'm already with Justin, says Emilio. Find someone else. Brian looks at the floor, wishing he could draw a hole right there to swallow him up. Mrs. Carlotti said we can have up to 3 people in our group. We're only 2. Come on, Emilio, let him work with us. Okay, I guess. Mrs. Carlotti gives the class directions for the project. Your assignment is to work together to write a story about what you see in that photograph. Use your imagination and have fun. Whoa, cool, says Emilio. What kind of people do you think would live in houses like that? I don't know, but I bet Brian could draw them to go with our story, says Justin. Brian smiles as he takes out his lucky pen. It's lunchtime again, Brian's least favourite part of the day. Another 20 long minutes of kids talking and laughing with everyone else, but him. Brian! He hears someone shout. Hey Brian! Over here! Brian turns and sees Justin waving him over. Emilio nods at Brian as he makes room for him at the table. Maybe, just maybe, Brian's not so invisible after all.